Policy Professor. To introduce this framework, I would now like to invite Professor Tarun Jayasinghe, Fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, Sri Lanka. Professor Jayasinghe is an Emeritus Professor of Medicine, recognized among the top 2% of scientists in the world. He is also a Fellow of the International Science Council and serves as an advisor to the ISC's online course on science advice. Professor Jayasinghe has been a pioneer in initiating Sri Lanka's national project on institutionalizing science advice, playing a central role in promoting evidence-based policy making within government institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Tarun Jayasinghe to present the Colombo framework.
Good morning to all of you, Honorable Minister, and invited colleagues and experts. Yeah, we are gathered here today to see how we could strengthen this path of getting evidence to policy. Now, the terms used include science advice to policy, or science advice to government, and various similar terms are used. So, what I hope to do is to describe some of the basic concepts, so that we are all on the same page. Now, this might be something too superficial for policymakers, but I think for scientists it's important that we realize what we mean by science advice. So, you can use these terms like evidence to policy or E2P or whatever, but the idea is basically obtaining and using the evidence which is out there to policymakers and politicians and so on. And when it comes to evidence and gathering evidence and synthesizing, I think the scientists have an advantage because we know where the evidence is. We have methods of synthesizing the evidence, collecting the evidence in a systematic way without bias, so that we present it to the policymakers and then they do what they think is right. That's one fundamental fact of life which scientists must understand. Just because you give evidence, that does not mean that the policymakers have to follow it. They have other factors to consider. Global geopolitics, local politics, elections, and those are realities which they have to take consideration of. So it's going to be a brief presentation. I'll introduce some aspects why this whole process came about. I think it's important, and we'll be reiterating some of these in the panel discussion which follows. A few concepts and a brief situation analysis of the science advice to policy in Sri Lanka and a framework to understand. We all remember the COVID pandemic, and I think it's fairly recent enough for us to grapple with this situation. Though we have been blamed about the various interventions which we did, Sri Lanka has done remarkably well. In other countries, they are still dying from COVID, especially the elderly are dying. And when they looked at the manner in which countries tackled COVID, they realized that there were a lot of gaps in this institutionalizing of evidence. How different countries responded. You must remember the situation we were in. It's very easy for us to say we should have done X, Y, or Z. But remember, we did not know that it was going from it was spreading, how it spread. We didn't know whether we should be wearing masks. In fact, the WHO said, do not wear masks. We didn't know how useful washing your hands were. We had separate things being invented to wash hands and even spray various things on our bodies. And one president in another famous country wanted to give the detergent to the people. So we didn't know what was happening. And it's important that how a country should respond to this sort of crisis or any other policy. And these have been tracked and explored in the literature. So you have tracking policy against COVID, which has been done by Oxford, the Oxford Super Tracker, and then the International Network for Government Science Advice, which also has tracked policy. And we realized the different ways we have institutionalized this process. So now I want to get to the basic concepts, because it's important that we understand this. And if you are to build capacity, we must know what we are talking about. This is the common mistake we make. When we talk of policy and science, we always tend to talk about policy about science, prioritization of science, prioritization of research, management of institutions, how are we going to give the grants and getting more grants for our researchers. But by science advice to policy or evidence to policy, we are flipping it the other way. And that's very important to remember, especially for the scientists, because we are very familiar with this aspect. So, in this process, you're using evidence to guide policy. So, it's not a case of policies related to science, but you're gathering the evidence to policy. Now, does that happen? Yes, of course it happens now in an informal way. Policymakers are able to obtain scientific information, it's available. You can have scientists who are in fact formulating policies. We see that all the time. Scientists embedded in committees or even in government ministerial positions. But in this whole discussion on evidence to policy, what we want to do is to make this pathway of evidence to the policymakers in a streamlined and institutionalized manner, so that it happens like a normal functioning system, right? So this is not ad hoc, where you give a call and say whether we should be bringing in fertilizer or what type of fertilizer we should be importing in the country. No, there is a well worked out system. Yeah, so this is the first one versus the second one. So what's the situation in Sri Lanka? If you have to improve this pathway, what's the situation in Sri Lanka? What are the mechanisms which provide evidence to policy? I've done a brief check on the literature, and you find we have science advisors
who have been appointed periodically. We have advisory agencies like the National Innovation Agency. We have a mix of experts coming in, as we saw with the coordination in Secretariat, etc. for COVID. We had Advisory Council, and I don't know whether the Sustainable Development Goals Council falls into that category. We have commissions like the National Education Commission, and we have several ad hoc arrangements like Presidential Task Forces from the time of Honorable PM, Prime Minister or President Premadasi. We had a series of Presidential Task Forces. So it's a case of looking at this situation and understanding the sort of mechanisms we have had. And when you go through their specific acts, it's again not clear what and how they're providing evidence. See the words which have been used: recommendations in one, formulating in another, recommendations in the National Education Commission, advising the government on policies by NASDAQ. So you have different words being used, different models being used, and it's important that we understand the background of this if you have to move forward. So in this study, we developed this Colombo framework, and we are using the word Colombo, and we are trying to brand things so that these become important internationally. Sri Lanka, Colombo, right? So that's the idea. So we use this to help us understand this process. Now I'll take you through this process. These can be improved, and this will become important when it comes to capacity building, SLIDA, when we try to tell scientists what we mean by getting evidence to policy. In fact, a recent paper in Nature, one of the most prestigious journals, stated that we have to train scientists on how to provide evidence. So let's go through this simple framework. Though things don't happen in a very linear or a circular fashion, it's for convenience and to understand the necessary concepts. So from policy, then there has to be a need to obtain advice. You have to frame the proper questions. You have to then gather evidence based on the research question, because from that beige to blue, the framing has to be done by the scientists and the policymakers working together. Then you gather the evidence, synthesize it, and communicate it and get it back to policymakers. So the need could arise from policymakers, and in this instance we have to think of the higher levels. We are not talking of a department in a ministry. That's also important. That's a different set of advice you require. We are talking at the national policy level, at the ministerial level, at the sector level, or at the cabinet level. How do you get the evidence which is available? So policymakers, parliamentary committees might say you want some evidence related to a particular aspect. And then the framing of the question is basically converting these problems which are there in the minds of the policymakers to a scientific sort of question. So when it was about COVID, how to reduce spread, then the question is, what's the mode of infection transmission? What's the cause? Initially we didn't know it was a mRNA virus, right? What's the virus? How is it spread? What's the dose required? What's the social distancing, and so on? And then you have to gather evidence. Now, this is where the scientists have an advantage, because we have systematic ways of gathering evidence using certain search criteria. Now, of course, AI can complement it, but you have to ask the correct questions from the database to gather evidence. And there are so many sources. For example, in some of the discussions, you find people just quoting and building their whole argument on a single paper. You can't do that. The scientists know that you can have different results for the same question from different sources, and you have to synthesize this using systematic review process or meta-analysis. There are scientific ways of synthesizing conflicting evidence. You can resort to expert opinion, policy papers, workshops, reports by international organizations which tend to synthesize the knowledge for us. Then you might want to do the process if the synthesis has not been done. Then the process must include synthesizing. So there are ways of developing consensus. Again, systematic ways of doing it, not over a cup of tea. There are systematic ways of arriving at a consensus and stakeholder engagement. In all this, Dr. Vinya will tell us about the importance of community engagement in this process. How do you communicate? Again, coming from the science field, they are very poor at communicating. We think when we write a letter to the President's Secretariat, the President is supposed to read your policy document and include it in the next budget. I mean, that does not happen, right? That does not happen. He probably gets about 10,000 letters like that. So you have to communicate. There has to be part for communication. You have to avoid jargon and simplify it. Now, for example, in UK, the science advice, they make policy papers relevant to some of the discussions which are going to happen in the parliament. It's available for opposition as well as government. It's available in the library. Now, in Sri Lanka, apparently the parliament library is one of the least used places. Things have to change. Things are changing, I think, because we are having people who understand. We are having people where we can discuss. When we say we want systematic review, the ministers seem to understand what we are talking. So we are bridging that gap. But it's important that we have protocols and methods for communicating worked out. Right? So you will see that if you have to really disaggregate this idea of getting evidence to policy, there are several steps which we have to go through. And when we go through these steps, we have to have an institution, some sort of mechanism which will do that for us. Even if all of us are dead and gone, the system should continue. Right? So, if you have to do that, you have to make sure that it's conducted in a way which is without bias, that there is enough diversity, those are the values, there is transparency, there is conflicts of interest are minimized, you don't get your personal biases into it. If you're a CEO or in a director board of a organization which is going to be influenced by the policy, explicitly state it or don't get involved in the decision making and so on. So those are also important if this is to succeed. And at the end of the day, we have to think of setting up institutions. This is why this term, institutionalizing science advice, because we need a sort of an institution, mechanism for this process. So it could be multiple institutions like the Education Commission and so on for sectors. It could be advisory councils for ministries. It could be a National Development Council, which we had some time ago, which Malaysia has at the cabinet level. It could be an advisory board advising the president. There will be several models, and we should have all those diverse models depending on the need. So each sector or each group could have its own structure. And we will need to look at existing legislation, think about amendment or new regulation, or maybe new legislation, new institution, and a whole set of circulars. So this summarizes, we started with COVID as an example. It was the need which showed us the varying experiences we have had of getting evidence to the policymakers, and below is the sort of framework which we can use. That's all I've got to say. I think we next get on to the panel discussion. At the end of the day, these are some of the topics which might be covered in the panel discussion, our previous experiences, so elaborating on the situation we have been in and what it means to institutionalize, why is it important, community engagement, and at the end of the day, we have to really, from when we finish this activity, we should have some idea as to how we are going to move forward, the way forward. Thank you very much.